Hello? Okay. Thank you. I'll begin with the chair. Chair Moore,
Here.
Vice Chair Brown, Member Bradford,
Here.
Member Grills,
Here.
Member Holder,
Here.
Member Jones Sawyer,
Here. See,
Member
everybody wanna be
Lewis, Member Montgomery Step,
here. See, nobody want to be
and
president no
Member
more.
Tamaki.
Here.
Thank you. Madam Chair, there are 9 task force members, and the number needed for a quorum is 5. The number present is 9, and we have reestablished a quorum.
Thank you. So we'll now turn to agenda item number 9, and I'll turn to Member Grills.
Thank you. So today we are going to hear preliminary findings from the Ralph Bunche Center, led by Dr. Michael Stoll and his team of researchers, as in graduate students from the Bunche Center. Dr. Stoll.
Thank you, Dr. Grills. It is great to be here, and we have a full agenda, so I will be short, but I just wanted to say that it has been an honor and privilege to be a partner with the task force and DOJ in this historic endeavor. Our project, and we'll follow this PowerPoint presentation, and I want to say that this project is we call the Community Engagement Project. And one of the joys of being on this project is to work with what I think are the best and brightest graduate students in the country who will also present findings from our engagement research project as well. Not only the best and brightest black graduate students, I said the best and brightest graduate students in the country. This community engagement project comes from tasks charged to us by the task force, and what the agenda will look like today, we'll talk very briefly about the background and purpose of our community engagement process, and then we'll turn to the findings, and the findings are in 3 different categories: community listening sessions, personal testimonies, and surveys, and then we'll conclude with some key takeaway from our project. The community engagement stakeholders are fairly clear, so I won't spend much time here. When we started the project back in January, we put together a research and organizing team led by, of course, the anchor organizations who were selected that you know by name that I won't discuss in detail, other than to say that we work with the Black Power Network, Other and Belonging Institute at University of California, Berkeley, the African Black Coalition, which is a coalition of students across the state of California, of higher education students across the state of California, the Black Equity Collective, the Black Equity Initiative, the Coalition for a Just and Equitable California, and Repaired Nations. In combination with our anchor organizations who led the charge in this community engagement part of the community listening sessions, we also had project leads, who were Mary Lee. She was termed the project convening organizer, who helped move the trains in project organization, in meetings, and along with Ama Nayim Meke, who was the lead professional project facilitator during the community listening sessions. Both Mary and Ama helped think and design the process and rhythm of the listening sessions that were part of our community engagement process. And of course, the Bunche Center was also part of this stakeholder group. The purpose and method of this community engagement process was to investigate, collect, and document perspectives on the 4 areas that I think the task force is most concerned about in this historic endeavor. That is, what is harm, the type of harm, the support for reparations in California, the forms or types of reparations support that might be considered, and the eligibility of recipients. And so each one of our phases of our community engagement plan focused on this area of inquiry. The community listening sessions were the meat of what this research project did. We'll talk a little bit later about the characteristics of these listening sessions, but this are listening sessions organized by the anchor organizations that invited community groups to talk about those 4 areas that I just mentioned. We also had personal testimony, both through a portal that was made available to California residents to upload their testimony, and through a series of qualitative interviews that we also did with participants in the listening session. Last, we also, as the research team, raised money, in part thanks to the California Wellness Foundation, to launch a statewide representative survey surveying Californians about their support for or not reparations and different kinds of reparations proposals, and we present that data today. All of this data we have collected in various ways. We've analyzed, documented, and we'll be presenting our findings here today. The project timeline was fairly tight for a research project. We started this project in January. We had listening sessions hosted by anchor organizations. Our statewide survey was launched in May and June. We just got the results back in late July, August. The listening sessions went all the way through August. And as you'll see, we transcribed every comment in the listening sessions and analyzed them. We only had 1 month to analyze all of those, to transcribe them and analyze them, and to report the findings preliminarily here today. Finally, we have personal testimony that we'll be sharing with you today that just took place in August. Now we'll turn our attention to the findings, and to present the findings from the community listening session, I'll turn the mic over to Jindalyn Coulter.
Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you all so much.
Rising privilege for Vice Chair Brown to say something.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I look forward to hearing further your report. But you know, the one thing makes me very nervous, that we will purport to do a presentation on community engagement. And there's absolutely no representation from the black faith community, which is the black community historically and presently. And number 2, nothing was mentioned of the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People that has a network across this nation and in this state. All I'm saying is that you need to put some yeast in your effort to make it rise. But you cannot talk about community engagement and not have the black faith community. The first meeting where they talked about reparations was on January the 12th, 1865, after General Sherman burned down Atlanta and marched toward Atlanta. And when Secretary of War Stanton asked him, what are we going to do with these ex-enslaved persons? He said, wait until we get to Savannah. In Savannah, we will call a meeting with the ministers. And Reverend Garrison Frazier and those 20 preachers were in that hotel room. And he asked Reverend Frazier, what does the union owe these ex-enslaved persons? Reverend Frazier said, I can't speak for everybody, but at least for me and my house, since we've been enslaved on this land all these years, we should have 40 acres and a mule. And from that meeting, General Sherman issued Field Order Number 15 that set aside that land from the coast of Florida up to South Carolina into Georgia, Alabama, and Mississippi. But we know what happened. It was that man, Andrew Johnson, that racist from Tennessee, who revoked it, and we were thrown into the peonage system. I hate to do this, I'm not talking down to you, but I'm saying the first thing we got to do inwardly as a community, realize where our real base is, and has been. And God and destiny will not bless us with success if we don't own and represent the basic institution, even before there were schools or community-based organizations. It was the black faith community that was always there.
Representative Task Force Member Brown, thank you. We share your concern. We share your sentiment. And the basis of our work is on those sentiments. May I ask that we complete our presentation? We were asked by the task force and DOJ to come and present our findings. We were given 1 hour to do so. We would very much like to be able to present, and afterwards, we would very much like to be able to answer any questions that there are. And we're not avoiding those, but we would, in the respect of the work that our graduate students have done to prepare for this meeting, which has been tremendous, we would very much like to be able to present for our time period. If that is simply a request.
Can you turn the mic? Yeah, before you begin, I just had one preliminary procedural question. I know I requested that you all send whatever work product that you all came up with in advance to task force members so that we could review it beforehand and so that they could be included in the meeting materials for the benefit of the public. So before you begin, my first question, is there a particular reason why the presentation wasn't sent in advance? So yeah, that's the first question.
In the best of all worlds, we would have had this presentation to you last week. But because of the turnaround challenge that we had, we've been working on this presentation right up until 1 minute before. Well, we didn't get all the data collected until the end of August. It's only September 23rd. Between end of August and now, we have analyzed over 1,000 pages of transcripts. We have written nearly almost all of the report, which is due September 30th. And we had put this presentation together starting 2 days ago and have been up for nearly 48 hours doing so. In the best of all worlds, we would have had this beforehand, but we simply worked as hard as we could, and now we are able to present to you, which is simply documenting what we've observed in the task force requirements, which is the community listening sessions. We've added additional added value information from personal testimonies that we've analyzed and through statewide survey, which we had gone on and raised additional private funds to be able to share with you a broad community engagement project that looks at not only those that have come to the community listening sessions, which include mostly 90% African Americans from all walks of life, including from faith-based organizations, civil rights organizations, et cetera, to report on the findings from those in an objective way that provides information for the task force as they deliberate the tasks that are put before them by the state, which is the study reparations proposals for African Americans. I would have loved to have them 2 years ago. The fact that we didn't means not other than that we were working as hard and just could not get it done before, and to be able to give anybody a copy of it.
And my second and final question, I'm really looking forward to the presentation. Again, it's a procedural point. And just a clarification, I think in my head, when we entered this contract with the Bunch Center, I think exactly last year, September 23rd, is when we started to have conversations with you all. My vision was that you all, at the end of the process, would be presenting an actual report, similar to the interim report. And so I guess I'm just clarifying, is this the final work product? Is the PowerPoint presentation, or will this be compiled into like an actual report?
The final report is due September 30th. We will have an actual written report that reflects what we are presenting here today to the task force on September 30th.
Okay, thank you. You can proceed, unless member Girls had any. Okay.
Jendalyn Coulter.
Yeah, thank you all so much, especially for just being here today and really engaging in the work. Yeah, reparations is it's long awaited, and I think the findings, especially from the community listening sessions, definitely indicate that as well. So without further ado, I'm presenting the summary of findings for the community listening sessions. the community listening sessions were one of 3 primary research methodologies that we employed throughout this year-long process in order to compile the widest extent and greatest depth of insights and perspectives. And the community listening sessions really helped kind of provide more of a in-depth just understanding of what Black Americans are going through and just Black people as a whole who reside within this country. So, research guiding questions. Essentially, through the listening sessions that were hosted throughout the state of California, they were primarily taken on by the anchor organizations that we collaborate with, and there were a set of specific research questions that were specifically developed so that way they can essentially garner the greatest insights relative to those 4 main areas that we aim to evaluate throughout our research and research report. So essentially, 3 of those guiding questions are: what is our vision for the future of Black California? What does it look like? What does it sound like? What does it feel like? The second question being, in order to repair harm, we have to acknowledge harm. And if you had to express 1 to 3 harms experienced throughout your day-to-day life, what would you specifically express, as well as what are 1 to 3 resolutions, right, that would be most beneficial, right, to combat those harms? Thirdly, sorry.
Take your time. It's okay.
Yes. Thank you. Yeah, so thirdly, the question that we widely ask within these community listening sessions is, as we think about some of these harms that were discussed throughout the dialogues and conversations that were had throughout these sessions, we're trying to understand, like, what are the best routes to help people heal and prosper within the state of California. So these were essentially what the listening sessions inquired from the public. So our timeline for the community listening sessions. Essentially, the community listening sessions were hosted from January of this year all the way through August, so roughly 8 months. And these sessions were, again, as I mentioned before, hosted by the anchor organizations. And so these organizations were housed across the state of California, from the Bay Area to Los Angeles to the Inland Empire. And so these sessions were hosted primarily within the communities of Black Californians throughout the state. So we really wanted a wide extent of insights and perspectives from, again, Black Californians who just reside throughout the state. Secondly, the analysis. So after the anchor organizations, in collaboration, of course, with Mary Lee, Ama Neemaki, who did tremendous just work with helping organize and helping just coordinate the entire efforts. We ensured that those sessions were recorded, so we have recordings of the conversations being had, right? And what we did was we took those recordings, we uploaded them to transcription services, so that way we would have the written just conversations just outlined for us, and then from there we aim to analyze those findings. Thirdly, my bad, we ended up, reading through these transcriptions. We really wanted to, again, analyze the widest extent of just emergent findings, especially relative to those 4 categories that we're aiming to investigate, right? So harms, resolutions, eligibility, and extent of support for reparations. And what you'll find, especially as we describe more so our process as well as the findings themselves, is that we were really able to extract, again, a lot of insights, and this is all going to be detailed within our report that is due to come out soon. So community listening session structure. So essentially, there were 17 official community listening sessions. They took place, again, throughout the state of California. However, there was a bit of a subset that were hosted via Zoom. And so, let's see. So yes, our analysis. So our analysis process, again, was inductive and deductive process. And again, we really aim to, through those 4 categories that we're aiming to acquire insights for and derive answers for, we were able to extract a wide range of themes. I mean, we're gonna go into quite a bit of them, but so far, I mean, there's roughly around 32 themes just that we've identified. And in terms of reliability and validity, we engaged in peer review as well as just a continual debriefing process, right, about how we're understanding what we're finding within the research as well as how we're choosing to basically analyze and code the themes. So organization of findings, again, as mentioned, we're analyzing types of harm, extents of support, resolutions, eligibility, and another category that was added later, which is significant trends. And so this category is anything emerging outside of the scope of our initial just project guidelines. So here we go, the meat of the project, right? We have the harms experienced. So as you find here, you see roughly, all of these categories of harm that were explicitly conveyed throughout the community listening sessions. And we actually have frequency shown down there at the bottom of the graph. And as you can see, again, these are the 5 most pervasive harms that were noted throughout the listening sessions. So educational opportunity, economic disenfranchisement, as you hopefully can see here. And then there's other harms as well that didn't necessarily come up as often, however, were significant enough to know and to definitely detail and highlight more, which again, we plan to do within the report. We have, again, food inaccessibility, so people, specifically detailing residing in food deserts, right? We have neighborhood and urban disinvestment, which, there were certain stories of people that relayed the fact that neighborhoods that they grew up in, that they still reside in, don't look the same. And specifically, there being less resources and opportunity there, just in general. So these are some things that we're gonna definitely explore. So I hope to go in depth on a few of these. I know we have a time constraint.
One moment, I want to inform my colleagues that Noel sent over this PowerPoint presentation to our emails in case we're having a little trouble seeing that from the screen. You can proceed, thank you.
Got you, no, thank you.
Oh, thank you, Member Javon Scott Lewis, for telling folks to send that over to us.
Most definitely.
Go ahead.
Okay, great. So, again, the most profound finding we had within the category of harms was actually educational and opportunity. And so it was actually this harm specifically that was quite prevalent. I mean, one thing I can say is within each of the listening sessions, it was at least noted at least 3 times within each one. So it was something that came up quite frequently, and the discussions had around it were pretty profound. And you'll see that again with block quotes from the transcripts that we embed into the report. Essentially, the subcategories and sub-themes that emerged from educational inopportunity were the lack of Black instructors in the classroom, right? And so there was conversation around how this specifically relates to the experiences of Black children within the classroom, right? Their connectedness to learning, and specifically, their connectedness to learning as well as their experience within the classroom, right? Here are some of the other sub-themes that were identified which underpin this broader scope of educational inopportunity. So we have a block quote here, but we'll go past. Yeah, so another, again, major finding relative to the harms experienced by Black Californians is actually economic disenfranchisement. And so with economic disenfranchisement, what really is central to this theme specifically is the fact that Black Californians widely conveyed experiences relative to just a quality of life that is remnant on having less financial means than their white non-Black counterparts. So again, that's represented here. You know, what specifically came up quite frequently was, you know, wage gaps. So we have the lack of comparable payment for forced labor outputs, in addition to lack of financial safety nets, in addition to just other areas which really underpin and just underscore just the quality of life as well as the experiences that Black Californians are able to have. Yes, so we're short on time, but again, another category here, you know, discriminatory policing and criminality. It's something that is more discussed, of course. However, these findings really depict an image that is quite frankly important for just state reps and people in law enforcement, just the wider scope of the community to know and understand. So again, another central category that we were tasked with investigating was the lack of, redact that, the level of support for reparations. Here we have two block quotes again, which kind of show you just differing levels of support for the initiative. And so we have quite a bit of varying responses relative to that. Again, then we have reparations-based resolution. So again, this is really getting at the question of what's gonna serve as most beneficial for Black Californians, right? What types of opportunities, what types of supports, what type of just investments is truly gonna serve as a catalyst to bolster them as a community and also just increase their life prospects. So what we find here, again, financial compensation was most frequently noted, as well as community investments, educational opportunities, and so on. So for financial compensation and opportunities, what's interesting is there was quite frequent reference of cash payments as a form of reparations that would be useful and beneficial, in addition to other forms of financial relief, right? So tax relief, receiving tax credits and deductions for, specifically for, you know, homes and for, like, property. Property was actually a pretty huge theme that came up, land ownership and property. And so again, as you can kind of see, some of these themes are kind of, they connect to one another and they're somewhat influenced by one another. If you don't own or possess property or a home, right, you have no home ownership, then you're more than likely susceptible to, you know, being housing insecure, not being able to provide stable living conditions for not just yourself, but for your family. And then that cycle just trickles down. So we see that as well. Again, we have investments towards sustaining Black community spaces. And so in a way, it almost reminded me of Dr. Brown, what you had mentioned about, you know, really just the faith-based community and like that, you know, being an integral part of the Black experience in America. You know, this theme really speaks to essentially just the importance of investing into Black community spaces that really help us just seek refuge within our community. So you see, again, we have some block quotes for resolutions as well. Employ you all to read them since you have a copy. Eligibility, again, this is just most common perspectives that emerge from the question of eligibility. And anytime reparations is mentioned, you know, that's a commonly heard question that emerges. And so, again, we just felt like it would be very just insightful to just understand and just as it came up naturally to just capture and document what the people, what Black Californians specifically are saying relative to that. So significant trends, there were quite a few trends that fell outside of those four predominant categories that emerged. We have acknowledgement of Black community exploitation, right? So people specifically, referencing a sort of demand for a public apology, a demand for acknowledgement. We also have, again, a few others here, as you can see. So I'm gonna hand it off.
We'll turn over now to our analysis of personal testimony, and that will be presented by Chi Nweye.
Thank you all. I'll just begin by saying it's just a privilege to be here. And so my hope is to help paint the story of what the community members shared by allowing them to speak for themselves. So I have a couple of excerpts that I'll play for you all. To begin, I'm just going to tell you a little bit about the data that we collected. So we collected personal testimony through a Box portal. So people were able to upload the information that they thought was relevant for the task force to know. So people shared photos, people shared audio recordings, and in total we ended up getting 46 items. And again, it was that mix of different media. We also had participation predominantly from African Americans living within California, but we did have some participation from individuals who lived outside of state. We also had some participation by individuals who did not identify as African American. Ultimately, all of the material that was in audio or video form was transcribed, similar to what happened with the listening sessions. And then from there, we ended up doing an analysis, which I'll talk about in just a moment. The other piece of personal testimony came from doing oral history interviews. So this was an opportunity to sit down with individuals and really have them tell us their story. Again, the focus was on African American voices, so all of the members were African American. We had 7 people participate in total, 4 women, 3 men. Depending on the length of the testimony that they wanted to provide, members were given an opportunity to do more than one interview. So in total, we did 11 interviews. All these interviews took place between August 4th and August 31st. So as Dr. Stoll said, a very tight turnaround. And these were all California residents. And there was kind of a nice split between Northern California representation and Southern California representation. And the age range, I don't think I mentioned that, but the age range was between 38 to 88. Going through the methodology very quickly. So we used a very similar methodology to what was going on with the listening sessions. That is, we started with the baseline material. So for the personal testimony that was submitted via Box, gathering all of that material, generating transcripts for anything that was in audio form or video form. And then again, identifying these themes. So looking and saying, what words are repeated? What phrases are repeated? What are general ideas that multiple people are talking about? And from there, kind of organizing to figure out how do we then synthesize this information? Going through the methodology for the oral history interviews, again, very similar. So we started by doing pre-interviews, which was an opportunity for the interviewees to really determine the focus of the interview, to say, these are the harms that I want to focus on. We really wanted to emphasize harm and being able to elaborate upon that through the interviews, just because, again, wanting to show the extent of what it is that Black Americans have experienced. And so they helped define what the scope of their interview would be. We then did semi-structured interviews, so having an outline that was derived from what the interviewee said they could speak most to. Once those interviews were conducted, and they were all conducted remotely, a transcript was generated, and then again, themes were identified. So getting into the findings, again, this is jumping back to the personal testimony that people uploaded via the Box. It was rather interesting because most people focused on remedies and support for reparation. There wasn't as much depth relating to harms. There was some, but it seemed like people felt more comfortable speaking to what they thought reparation should look like. So very consistent with what we found in the community listening sessions. Financial compensation was a big one, especially direct payment. That also encompassed employment opportunities, which I'll talk about more when I get to the oral histories, but education was a big one where people felt like it was support systems for education and also having financial support for it. There was housing and land ownership was another big theme that people said was important. There was also lineage-based eligibility, which had predominant support from most of the respondents. And then I thought I did something. And then there was setting a precedent beyond California, which was very, very interesting. And you'll be able to see more of this in the report. But there was this constant theme of what is being done here, just in considering the process of reparations. People wanted it to set a precedent for what's being considered in other states and at the federal level. As I mentioned, we had several participants who were actually not California residents, and so they shared their stories about why they thought that this was important to their states as well. Getting into the personal testimony, and like I said, I really want to be able to provide the space for these individuals to speak for themselves. So I've selected a couple excerpts to play for you all. I think that the tech team might have to play it for us. If you can click the first audio link.
Here are some questions I basically want to ask the California Task Force as it relates to reparations. I know that we constantly hear from media critics, what is a free state doing paying for reparations, or how can a free state be responsible for slavery, etc. Here are some questions we should consider. Did the state of California participate in the destruction of black families who descend from the formerly enslaved? Did California participate in the economic deprivation of black families who descend from the formerly enslaved? Lastly, was this state an accomplice to all three branches of our federal government in the state-sanctioned oppression experienced by those who are the descendants of the formerly enslaved generation after generation? If the answer is yes to these questions, then it's settled. We must establish a baseline based on the harms endured by a majority of those families.
Thank you. And I'll provide for context. We have 3 more clips that are going to be coming up, just in case it wasn't clear. The link below, for anyone who needs support in reading it in addition to hearing it, you can click that link and you can see the written transcript. So getting into the findings from the oral history interviews, again, very consistent both with what was submitted via Box and what was brought up in the community listening session. So employment, I'll begin by saying because we knew that the focus for the oral history interviews was harms, these are the main findings that I'm highlighting today, but there will be more extensive findings in the report. So employment, forced labor, business hardship. There are actually a number of the interviewees who spoke directly about either their descendant being enslaved in California or being connected, someone living in California who was formerly sharecropping. So there was actually one descendant whose grandmother is still alive and was a sharecropper, and so he was able to bring in her testimony by sharing her story. Also, challenges related to business and employment generally. So I'll actually have a clip that highlights that. But accessibility, support systems, social networks, being given disproportionate amounts of work relative to compensation. Those are all things that continue to emerge through the interviews. There was also education and accessibility. I'll have a clip on that in a second. But particularly within higher education and professional education, there was a lot of discussion about how that has been challenging to either get admitted or it's been challenging to finance oneself through that process. There's also housing and land ownership, particularly 2 of the really important themes that came up are inherited property and challenges around maintaining that inheritance. So there's a lot of discussion about heirs property and this idea that one family might have owned land, but over a series of years, if one individual ends up selling their portion of the land, it makes it a much more precarious position for the rest of the holders because that one outside individual can force the sale of the land. And someone actually highlights that in their personal testimony that'll be in the report. There's also failure to acknowledge the true history. That was a recurring theme, and that connected back to education, but it was even sort of a separate part from just like formal education, just this idea that there's a history that has been hidden. There's history that has not been accessible to people. So people talked about transparency of records and things of that nature. And then lastly, psychological and emotional trauma. And one of the clips is going to highlight that for you. So I have 3 clips that I'm going to play for you. This first one is talking about higher education inaccessibility. And if you can cue up the clip for me, please.
just to share, my wife is a nurse too. And so she ended up having high honors when she graduated from like the LVN nursing school, but she couldn't get into any RN programs in the state of California despite that. So she actually had to go to school in Idaho because they ended up just accepting her, like immediately, not immediately, there's a process, but I mean, they saw, like her experience and everything, and they accepted her, but she, like all the programs that she tried to apply for in the state of California, like she couldn't get in any despite having high honors. I think she had like the fourth or third highest GPA of like her graduating class. So.
What year was this that your wife was trying to get into RN programs?
I think she tried, it was a process, so it was probably like a couple years where she was trying different ones. I would say maybe like between 2016 and 2017. Because I believe she started in 2018 is when she actually started the program.
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
And had to go to Idaho for it.
Yes, she did. And actually, because I wanted to make sure she was able to succeed at what she wanted to do. So while she was there, I had the kids with me here. Despite, and at that time I was working 2 full-time jobs. And so then I ended up just start working 1, but I was still working overtime and stuff. And so I had all 4 of the kids while she went to school because I wanted to make sure she was able to do what she actually wanted to do, so.
I hope that clip helps illustrate, again, some of the specific harms that people have experienced related to higher education accessibility, and really painting the picture of how it not only affects the individual, but the family unit, as the narrator expressed. He then was taking care of all 4 of his children while his wife was completing her RN program in a different state. Let me jump to the next clip, which is going to talk to the theme of those employment hardships that I mentioned earlier. So this is one of the sub-themes, lack of social capital. So for context, this is someone who was born outside of California, but was moved to California when she was in her early 20s, and talking about the hardships that she experienced despite having college education and having a job lined up by the time she moved here. Next clip, please. Yeah.
I wasn't doing well. I was educated, I came here, I had a job when I came here. That job got to be weird because I didn't get a raise after 3 years. I don't think there was any other employee, honestly, that experienced that. The company that I work for, and I'm not gonna say their names because I don't want to be sued, but the company that I work for was a business management firm, and literally every person I think that won a Grammy in 1993 was rep by that firm. I had the senior partner tell me, and I was young, I was like 21, 22 maybe, it was the year after I graduated from college. I had the senior partner come to me and tell me, you are too smart. You're the kind of person who, if I train you, you're gonna take everything you are gonna learn and you're gonna leave. So this man mentored many people. He has 2 children that grew up to be actors that I knew when they were tiny little kids. One of his sons became a talent manager, and he mentored people. But what I was told was that I was too smart. Who does that? And you don't give me a raise for 3 years? And what professionally, I'm educated in a profession that at that time, people learned their job. So there were people doing my job that had just learned their job, but I actually understood accounting because I had an accounting degree. And you made a conscious effort to basically not teach me.
Okay, and we have our last clip, which is going to speak to, again, that psychological and emotional trauma that I said was one of the other emergent themes. Play the clip, please. Thank you.
And one of the things that you mentioned is in deciding to accept the settlement, you wanted to be able to be a mom again. To the degree that you feel comfortable, what ways did you find that focusing, working on your case took you away from being a mom?
Depression. I was very depressed, unable or just failing to engage in the way and at the level that I did. I think when I had my daughter, one of the things that I always wanted her to know was that when she entered a room, that I was happy to see her, that I was joyful to see her, that her just entering a room would light me up and light up my life. And when I was going through this process, I found I was very unhappy, and that when she entered a room, I wasn't joyful. Just her presence would literally bring me joy, because I wanted this child so badly, and I had this beautiful baby. And so when I was going through this, just not engaging in a way that she deserved.
And for context with that clip, the period in which we were talking about, this narrator had shared that she had actually been employed by the state of California and had filed a suit on the basis of racial and gender discrimination, and had been going through the lawsuit process and ultimately settled as a result of, again, this trauma, this having to give up the joy of just being joyful when her daughter would come into the room. And so I thought it was such a poignant clip to be able to share. I'll note that in the report, there will be a number of other clips that, similar to what's presented here, will be actually, you can hear them, because I think that some of the power of the testimony comes from the pauses and comes from them finding the word and hearing the voice go up and down. And so I want to say thank you so much for this opportunity. Pass it back to Dr. Stoll.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Elliot Woods. I will be presenting the results of our survey. And also, I'm very honored to be here and work on this project. Okay. So our survey was conducted from May 10th to June 6th for the state sample. And we concluded our survey for the community sample on August 31st, 2022. Next slide, yeah, sorry. So in our state sample, we had 2,449 residents. And for the community sample, we had 1,934 community members participate. Based on the questions we asked, we were able to establish 3 categories for measures, our main measures.
Can you explain the difference between statewide and community, please?
Yes, I apologize for that. So we did a statewide survey, which went out to the state as a whole, and then we conducted the same survey within the community listening sessions throughout the anchor organizations. So they are essentially the same survey, just conducted in different spaces. One was done by Lucid Holdings, which is a non-partisan and third-party entity, and then the other one was mainly hosted through the anchor organizations and their outlets. May I proceed?
Yes.
Thank you. Okay. So based on the survey questions, we were able to identify 3 main reparation measure categories. One would be direct cash compensation. We have monetary, no cash, which includes business investments, college grants and scholarships, down payment assistance, debt forgiveness, housing, medical coverage, and universal basic income. And for non-monetary measures, we had an apology, education reform, and also monuments and restoration of seized property. Section. Based on our findings, we show that there is support for reparations, and that support is strong for monetary no cash measures and non-monetary measures. As you're looking at the screen, you can see that direct cash has 64% throughout the state. Sorry about that. And then we have, for non-monetary, we have 73%, and then for monetary no cash, we have 77% of statewide participants that voted in favor of. Next slide, please. When we broke it down by race, we were able to see some significant differences in regards to what measures they did support based on race. And as we see, Black respondents had responded to the direct cash payment the most. For non-monetary and for monetary no cash, we saw consistency in regards to support, thus them being the ones that seem to be carrying measures that would be acceptable for those that have participated in these surveys as reparations. Next slide. Okay, so again, we're just reiterating the fact that like throughout the survey, we saw the consistency of monetary no cash and non-monetary measures being supported by all, roughly 2/3 of the entire sample. And then for direct cash measures, we saw that the support was strongest within Black respondents and the Latinx respondents. Nearly half of white respondents did support direct cash in comparison to 86% of Black respondents. When we were able to evaluate across the rest of the demographics, we were able to identify the same trend, which is monetary no cash measures have the strongest support. And this support is led by younger Californians, roughly those that are under the age of 45. Women overwhelmingly did support more than men. More educated, those with a bachelor's or higher tended to support the monetary no cash. And then we also saw Democrats that were supportive of it, and to a lesser extent, we did see that independents had a significantly strong amount of support for monetary no cash and non-monetary measures. Next slide. When we were able to do an analysis across the community sample survey and the state sample, we were able to see that there were some distinctions in regards to the support for direct cash, monetary no cash, and non-monetary measures. As you can see, the state sample shows 62%. And then we're going to look at direct cash from the community sample. It's at 96%. It's fairly consistent throughout the state sample. We were able to, thank you. We were able to look at just the respondents from the state sample that were Black, and we saw some consistency in regards to direct cash support. We also saw for the monetary no cash support that it was fairly consistent as well. There was a little bit more support when we look at the state sample. They were a little bit closer in regards to support for the measures. And non-monetary, again, we saw the same consistency. We do see that Black respondents were favoring a lot of monetary, no cash, and non-monetary measures. Next slide. We looked into the question of eligibility just to get the public sentiment in regards to their positions on it, and we're able to show the results here. We'll go to the next slide. So our findings essentially ended up showing that there is support for lineage-based descendants reparations, and we saw it supported more often within the community listening sessions and those participants. But between the state sample and the state sample of respondents that were Black, and also with the community sample, we saw a similar level of support. And now I will turn it over to Dr. Stoll. Thank you for your time.
So just to conclude very briefly, I wanted to provide what we think are the key takeaways. So we examine community engagement through these three distinct different ways: through documenting what went on in community listening sessions, through personal testimony as analyzed from the uploaded testimony in the Bunch Center portal for the task force, as well as qualitative interviews with community listening session participants and others. And finally, the third avenue of inquiry was from our surveys, one from a statewide representative sample of California. This was a representative sample of Californians, and the survey of those who participated in community listening sessions. And by and large, through each of those different areas of inquiry, we converge on what we think is common themes, knowledge, and conclusions around questions of harm, questions of reparation support, questions of the types of reparation support, as well as, to a lesser extent, questions about who should be eligible. What the key takeaways from all three of these different areas of inquiry are that this project really documents that there is a significant, even in 2022, people experiencing racially based harms in the community, and we're not even able to get into the interactions between African Americans and the criminal justice system or the healthcare system to really elevate what those harms may be experienced by members of the state of California. And what is also clear is that people also don't, that not only did they experience them, but experience these harms, but that they've substantially reduced their quality of life in measurable but in very different ways. The community in particular through the community listening sessions and our personal testimony and qualitative interviews, all desire acknowledgement of these harms, all desire some recognition of the extreme, disproportionate, historically unique experiences of African Americans, even in California, and they all uniformly want remedy of some sort. Those harms are uniquely identified in all of the inquiries. The biggest of these is education inequities and opportunity, questions about home and land ownership and whether or not that land ownership or home ownership has been impacted by racial discrimination or other measures that are influenced by race, and economic measures. So those were the three main areas of harm. Surprisingly or unsurprisingly, when people talk about what should be done, uniformly they talk about remedies in education, in home markets, land markets, and in economic markets broadly writ, be it through business entrepreneurial loans, be it mortgage-based relief, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Though there are still strong sentiments around direct cash compensation. The reason why we examine survey responses for support of direct cash compensation as opposed to, for example, monetary measures that don't include cash is because nationally, when most people are asked whether or not they support reparations, in almost 99.9% of the cases, respondents, especially non-Black respondents, correlate reparations with direct cash transfers. No, well, yes. And what happens when you survey them on support broadly outside the African American community is that when people see reparations tied with direct cash contributions, nationally support for reparations goes down. In our survey, what we wanted to do, which was unique, is to add monetary measures that don't include cash transfers, but that essentially could be also financial transfers, which from an accounting standpoint might be equivalent. Once you frame reparations around a broader set of remedies that include monetary measures, support for reparations, particularly outside of the African American community, goes up. That is just a descriptive observation that we see from the survey. Again, though, still, even in California, majority of Californians support direct cash remedies to compensate for harms to African Americans, but there's stronger support as measured by the survey for monetary measures that don't include cash, that also include financial transfers. But still, these monetary measures are driven by very strong support across the board in California for educational interventions, universal basic income, housing support, and business investment. When we submit our report, we'll be able to identify those exact measures and their level of support in California, which we're able to group here, but in our report, we'll disaggregate them more finally so you can see what areas of support have broad support in California. Again, all of the inquiries seem to have convergence in understanding across our different areas of inquiry. The one exception is on eligibility. So statewide eligibility, who should be eligible for reparations, differs in the state sample and for the state sample of African Americans, where there's split opinion around whether it should go to those who are descendants of slaves as opposed to all black people. Those are the two modal responses by Californians generally and by African Americans in that sample. For the community listening session sample, which is 90% African American, those who went to the listening sessions, overwhelming numbers, a clear supermajority of support lineage-based reparations. Thank you. We really appreciate the opportunity to be a partner with you in this effort, and we hope that this in-depth analysis of community engagement project for the task force serves as important information as you deliberate reparations proposals going forward.
Thank you so much, Professor Stoll and the UCLA Bunch Center for this work. Does anyone have any comments or questions? I have one clarifying question. So when did you say the report, you're going to publish the report? When did you say? The 30th of this month, right?
Yeah, the September 30th is the due
Okay,
date.
I just
for
wanted
the
to
report.
make sure. I thought you said December. I was like, wait, no, the contract says
We can
September.
agree that December could be the deadline.
No, I was just wanted to know if you were asking for an extension or something. So, okay. So as defined by the contract, it's going to be ready by the end of this month. All right, thank you. Any other comments, questions? Member Gross?
Kind of to your point, I just want to commend the Bunch team for those who do research. You have to understand, this was a Herculean effort to get even to this point of a PowerPoint. If the data collection didn't end until August 31st, then you've got quantitative data that has to be cleaned, prepped for analysis, go through analysis, and then turn it into some kind of digestible pieces of information. And the qualitative data analysis is even more complicated and more time-consuming. So I have to commend you. This is not typical, this kind of turnaround. And I appreciate the fact that you were able to do that and do it so comprehensively. Thank you.
Yes, Member Jones Sawyer, you're recognized.
It is on. And I also want to make sure we commend the young people, the young African Americans who worked on this. I know adults with much more experience and many more degrees that haven't produced this kind of quality work. And so Professor Stahl's, your mentorship and your leadership has shown in these three students, and I commend each of them, and we should definitely give them a round of applause. Thank you. And this is from an SC grad, so.
Yes, Vice Chair Brown, you're recognized.
Thank you, Madam Chair, members of the task force. I too commend the science and the research and for the engagement of the panel. And, no, I didn't say but, and I still contend, in order that your universe is not skewed, that base that I mentioned of the black community has to be involved in any further deliberations, or else we will be exclusionary. And that's what we've been accusing the oppressors of, being exclusionary. We need to be inclusive as we go forward. We will differ, yes, but we must not exclude the humanity of anybody in our community if we're going to be successful. The other thing I would like to say is that I found it, I'm not gloating here, but I found it to be very much that I must have been on the right wavelength. I've said all along that the best expression of reparations should be lineage-based. And your study, your survey, I know this was a beginning point, but your survey revealed the same. And this is no time for us to gloat over who won in the vote. It's time for us to be united. And go forward with this measure. And as I said earlier, if we can pat our heads, rub our bellies, at the same time, we don't have to wait and extend this process. We can still have the vision further. There's one room that's never filled, and that's the room for improvement. That's right. That's one room that's never filled. It's the room for improvement. Remember Dr. King's first book, his autobiography, was entitled Strides Toward Freedom. And we made a major stride toward get it out of my tongue, reparations in this process. And I commend you to the highest. So hold your hope, keep going, and let's stay together.
Thank you, Pastor Brown. Just for the record, I want to share that there was not exclusion of either the civil rights organizations or the faith-based community. And in fact, Black Equity Initiative actually includes the faith-based community. And they did do outreach to them. I also want to say that I personally did outreach to faith-based communities, to churches, to Black churches, and asked them to get involved. And I know that I saw them putting announcements in their Sunday service program books about the task force, about the interim report, and about this particular task force hearing. I also want to say that there was outreach to the national civil rights organizations and their local chapters. I personally sent personalized emails to about 30 to 40 civil rights and national Black organizations, including the NAACP, the Urban League, National Action Network, and more. None of them responded except the Black social workers and the Association of Black Psychologists, to participate in listening sessions, to get the word out, to form study groups. I even reached out to Mark Morial and asked him, could he pull together the national civil rights organizations that cut across racial groups to take on the reparations issue? No response. So there has been an effort. It has not been overlooked.
Jonda, if there's anybody who knows the national network of the faith community and the civil rights community, I do. And the basic point that I'm making, that in this state of California, There was no reaching out for the representation of the organizations that they cited at the beginning. So there's no attack on you. Maybe you made some effort, but I'm saying in terms of the person I know, and I was on a call just this past week with 42 pastors, 42, right here in this area. And they did not know about what was going on today. Now, so we don't need to debate it, but the point I'm making is that we got to make sure that we let people know that we really want them to be involved. And many times you do it, as the great communicators indicate, you do it 2 or 3 ways. Through the written, through the oral, and through the visual, if you really want them involved.
Member Javon Scott Lewis, you
Thank you.
recognize.
Can you hear me? Okay.
Yes.
First of all, thank you for your work. I really appreciate it, and for really helping to bring a broad perspective of the community to us today. I have a question about the harms experience slide. I think it's slide number 15. Just a clarifying point, you might have mentioned it and I missed it, and I apologize if I did. So were these harms generated from the samples themselves or from the communities, or were these provided as options in the survey?
So for these harms specifically, these were obtained from directly individuals within the community listening sessions, participants who, when asked, one of our primary guiding research questions, had listed these sorts of things. So yeah, they weren't predetermined, they were just emergent.
That's helpful. So the reason why I'm asking is I'm going back to our earlier discussion about the scope of work for the economists, and so these 5 harms really do comport with what the economists identified as the areas that they can, reliably account for. But, with the addition of the educational component, which Member Grills rightly brought up. So I think I just wanted to say that there's a nice, conjoining here of what you found in the community and what the economics team is able to really address, right now. And so I think it's good for us to continue to really focus on those areas. That was the question. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay. Yes, go ahead.
I just wanted to say that I'm also looking forward to the written report, because I think that there's a lot of nuance in the findings, particularly around the issues of forms of reparations, eligibility, et cetera, and that there's a lot of important implications of what some of this data has said in terms of how we move forward. So I don't think it's a cut and dry, and I don't think it's an all or none, and that we would do well to really do some thinking, deep thinking about what we see when we get the written report.
Thank you. Okay, well, thank you all so much. We're going to go to the next agenda item, which...
Thanks again.
Yes, thank you so much. On the next agenda item, which is communication strategy, me and Member Grills serve on that advisory committee, so I'll take it to Member Grills if you want to share our update.
And Professor Stoll, don't go far in case there's a question that you can better answer than I. So in terms of updates regarding communications, there has been another firm identified. That particular firm has gone through all but the final stage of being ready to start working. We had hoped that it would have happened prior to this particular task force meeting, but Professor Stoll, maybe you can explain the step that we're at now and what the potential time projection is.
Yeah, we had identified, successfully began contracting with the communications firm who will come on board in early July. And we just got word on Friday, a week from today, a week past from today, that they were approved, both as a vendor and their PO status, and we were just waiting for them to get their PO to sign it so that they could begin work. So they're probably searching their email every day to get that final PO to sign off, and they're ready to rock and roll. Once that happens, then obviously they will communicate with you on what would be the ongoing communication strategy and effort for the task force.
So other than that, there's really nothing else to report on in terms of communications until we can onboard a communications firm. But I think it is very clear that we desperately need one, particularly to help promote the interim report, to help begin increasing the visibility of the task force's work, including to civil rights and faith-based. I think that would have helped to have them on board. And so we're looking forward to perhaps getting this on track soon.
Me too.
All right, thank you. Member Bradford, you're recognized.
Is there a website that is specifically dedicated to the reparations task force, separate and apart from DOJ? I think that's needs to be built out if it doesn't exist. That's critical, because that's all I hear all the time is, when's the next meeting? How do I get information? So I think that should be part.
Yeah, there's a website that it was tied specifically to the community engagement process. The communications firm would have the responsibility of developing and managing a website generally covering the activities of the task force.
Any other questions or comments? Okay, thank you, Member Grills, and thank you again, Professor Stoll. So we'll now go to the next item on the agenda, which is item number 11, discussion and potential action item, leadership roles and assignments for part 2 of the task force. And I'll turn to the DOJ now for facilitation.
Thank you very much. So this agenda item is in recognition of the fact that we are, I'll just take my mask off. In recognition of the fact that we are midway, we've completed report 1, and as you are seeing as this meeting proceeds, report 2 is going to require a lot of involvement from the task force in terms of working through all of these very complex issues that we'll be working through with the experts. We thought it made sense to agendize a point in the agenda where we could discuss the roles and assignments for the second part of the task force. Right now, we have a number of different advisory committees that are handling a number of different topics. First and foremost is if there's any desire to revisit those advisory committee assignments, that informed by the fact that it is our recommendation, and we'll talk about this more as we go through the future meeting schedule tomorrow, but it is our recommendation that the task force make a decision in terms of assigning out 2 members of the task force or 2 advisory committees of the task force the various different issues. You've heard the experts speak to 5 areas of harm. There's also a number of issues that are still remaining to be addressed, including apology, public education about the task force's work. We'll talk about our recommendation around doing some kind of public education campaign for students through development of a curriculum that can be used to teach the task force report, and other issues. So there are a number of different roles in which the task force, a number of you have expressed interest in being involved. We also have, obviously, as we've heard, a strong desire from the expert team to have different involvement in different specific issues, not necessarily the overall work that Member Lewis and Chair Moore are working on, but the different individual action items. So Member Grills mentioned education. Would you want to have an education advisory committee that would focus on that issue? Do you want to have an apology advisory committee that would would work on what that should look like. So it's really, we created space on the agenda in order for the task force members to have a discussion about what you'd like to do. You can vote on it. It is agendized to allow for a vote for nominations of different advisory committees. You could also have the conversation tomorrow about what the future meeting agenda looks like for the task force and potentially key the advisory committees or individuals designated for different tasks to the meeting plan so that advisory committees or individuals can report out and have a schedule. Essentially, that meeting plan could also be when members are reporting out on their substantive subject.
So before I volunteer for a committee, what will it entail? For example, I'm thinking of criminal justice, public safety, incarceration. Since I am the chair of public safety, that might be something me and me possibly, I don't mean to volunteer, Mr. Bradford, but we both are chairs of public safety. And so we have chairs of public safety here with staff that can help work on this, which would also help alleviate maybe some workload on you and the DOJ staff. And so what kind of workload are we talking a workload help, or are we talking all of the above? Input, what our knowledge of what the criminal justice, they were talking about incarceration rates and things of that nature. I can get that for this committee where you wouldn't have to strain to get that information on a statewide basis and on a local basis, as Mr. Bradford could do too.
Well, it's an excellent point. So it's not exactly that, but we definitely will be looking forward to your assistance in terms of getting data through the legislature, through the state archives and other things. So we definitely are looking for that. What this is really more looking at, there's a finite number of meetings we can have before the deadline for the report. And this is a lot of work. And under the Bagley-Keene Act, the work of the task force is happening at these public meetings. This would really allow for one or two members to work with DOJ staff and the experts in working through the various issues that need to actually be worked through and then coming back to the task force with a recommendation. For example, if we took education, there is a need in the second report. There's recommendations about education that are in interim report 1. Then if you wanted to talk about what the cost of those harms are, working with the expert to develop the data that is necessary to substantiate those costs, what those costs are, and then what the potential reparations for that would look like, rather than just having the experts and DOJ staff doing that on our own, having active involvement sort of on the ground as we're working through it from one or two task force members, and then having, when we come back to the task force to finalize recommendations and essentially the contents of report 2, maybe that member of the task force will be able to present that issue to the task force. In other words, a little slightly different from what we did with report 1, where we were reporting back on the contents of the outlines, because that was really fact-based and legal-based. As I've mentioned a couple of times, this second part of the report is going to involve a lot of decision-making by the task force. And so some of that preliminary decision-making would be useful to have on the ground with DOJ staff and the experts as we work through the issues. Does that answer your question?
Yes, thank you.
Well, I will say that tomorrow we will be discussing in depth, and I say we're having essentially a primer on international law and human rights law. Because if you look at AB 3121, which created the Reparations Task Force, it mandates that our final recommendations comport with international human rights law standards. And so tomorrow you'll be hearing from expert witnesses who will be educating members of the task force, including myself, and members of the public around the forms of reparations under international law. We briefly touched on this topic at our first substantive hearing, literally 1 year exactly ago, September 23rd and 24th, 22nd and 23rd of last year, where we invited Cam Howard to educate us about human rights, because I think he was one of the people who put that language into HR 40, which is based on AB 3121. So I say all that to say, in the event that we do subcommittees or advisory committees around discovering what our recommendations will be, I think if we do that, because we had a conversation, me, member Jovan Scott Lewis, in our future hearing proposal advisory committee about whether that's a good idea or not. Should we all, as 9-member task force, just come up with the recommendations together, or should we kind of outsource and do these subcommittees or advisory committees? If we do these subcommittees or advisory committees, I do think in terms of structure, it would be helpful to structure them around the different forms of reparations under international law. So there's already under international law, there's 5 forms of reparations: compensation, restitution, rehabilitation, satisfaction, and guarantees of non-repetition. So there's already, in a way, a compensation advisory committee, which consists of myself and member Jovan Scott Lewis. We've been working with the economists over the summer. Based on what I think member Reggie Jones Sawyer is saying, as someone who's an expert in criminal justice and public safety, as well as member Bradford, that could look like an advisory committee on guarantees of non-repetition. And so what that would look like is, maybe tomorrow at our next hearing, we come up with these advisory committees in advance of, and this will make more sense tomorrow when me and member Jovan Scott Lewis actually present our future hearing proposal. What it would potentially look like, and I'm just thinking out loud, is today or tomorrow or in our next hearing, we'll come up with these advisory subcommittees based on the 5 forms of reparations under international law. And in that way, we already know upfront who's working on each form. And then the rest of the hearings will be based on these actual forms of reparations under international law. And in that way, we already know we have some assurance that there are task force members who have already been working on, alongside the DOJ and whoever else, on formulating what preliminary recommendations might look like for each of those forms of reparations. And then in our actual hearing, as the 9 members, we can, hear what each committee has to say and then come up with the final plan together as a group. I hope that makes sense, but I wanted to get your feedback on that.
That is like a thing. I don't know. So I agree with you that we should try to designate, further, subgroups, subcommittees to work on a range of issues. I think, we will know better tomorrow what exactly some of those areas will be. I think there's a sense that we may want to take the literal text of AB 3121 and try to assign responsibility that way. But then there are also a whole host of other issues that we need to kind of decide on. And so I'm not really quite sure yet if I feel we are prepared to assign responsibilities, because I don't think we fully appreciate the scope of what we still need to do. And so, I think by tomorrow we should hopefully know a little bit more. I know tomorrow, I know there's a big gap between tomorrow and the next time that we meet, and I understand the urgency of trying to get some things, on the book, so to speak. But I think we need a bit more clarity as to what we are hoping to accomplish. And I think hearing at least a little bit about these different models will give us some idea. And then I think at that point we can know better what we think we can do collectively and then as these smaller units.
Agreed. All right, any other comments on this? So yeah, I agree. After we receive a primer from the expert witnesses and after member Jovan Scott Lewis and I give a presentation on what future hearings could look like, I think we'll be in a better position collectively to start assigning roles.
And just if it's helpful for everyone to think about, just to be a little clearer about exactly where we are, just as a starting point. Obviously, as you're saying, Member Lewis, this is going to be an ongoing conversation, but just to make the very concrete issues that are sort of ready now or would be ready based on this conversation tomorrow, what we can think of in terms of concrete roles would be the question of how do you educate California's public? That's in the statute, that's one of the issues. The question of how and what form an apology should take, that's another issue. And then recapping what we heard from the experts, depending on how you want to address this tomorrow, the 5 harms and atrocities: the unjust property takings by eminent domain, devaluation of black businesses, housing discrimination and houselessness, disproportionate black mass incarceration and over-policing, and health harms. And I guess I would also probably add to that education. I know that that's something that came up in the surveys and was mentioned today. So those are sort of the 8 areas off the top of my head and off of the materials you have before you that would be ripe for starting to take action again, so we can meet the deadline of June 2023.
So do you think we might be able to make some preliminary decisions around, if not decisions, about, this allocation of responsibilities during unfinished business tomorrow? Would that be an appropriate time to do that?
Yes, absolutely. You'll like you said, you'll discuss it. I just wanted to mention those so everyone can think about it overnight.
Okay, thank you. And just to clarify, the concrete roles that we can start assigning as soon as tomorrow: educating California public what a formal apology from the state of California might look like, compensation related to the 5 harms and atrocities outlined by the economists, including education. Was there anything else?
Well, no, not right now. I mean, one of the things that you'll talk about tomorrow is, we have those 5 areas, 5 harms, 5 areas of atrocities. Obviously, the statute includes a lot of other areas. The report talked about a lot of other areas, so it'll be, the task force will have to vote and decide when you schedule the meetings, how many of those do you want to take on? All of those? Is that something we have to work with our experts on, because they've identified these, but that's based on the readily available data. So if you have those other harms get addressed or how they get addressed, we'll have to figure out what other types of remedies will come into play on those if there's not data for straight reparations or something like that.
Madam Chair, members of the task force, do we feel that we should more explicitly deal with how these African-American communities, we just touched on it here, but South Central, the Fillmore, those were watering holes where we celebrated our culture and our history. I think we need to be more specific, because also Allensworth, we should be specific. And these areas were torn up, bulldozed, and we were pushed out by public policy, all of them. And we have the evidence of that, and we don't have to go way back to bring up the facts.
Thank you for that. Yeah, as an international law scholar, the things that we need concrete roles on, I'm just seeing, for instance, educating for California public. That's something that the Communications Advisory Committee could work on. Formal apology, that is a form of reparations under satisfaction. So there could be a whole group who's maybe interested in figuring out what the symbolic forms of reparations might look like, including a formal apology. As I said, the 5 harms and atrocities is related to compensation, which is a form of reparations under international law, and Jovan and I are already working on that. I just brought that up to say what you just mentioned in terms of a historic watering holes, Bruce's Beach, South Central LA, Fillmore. Under international law, when we're talking about, the accounting of stolen land, right? That is restitution. Restitution is one of the 5 forms of reparations under international law. So, if you're passionate about that, I'm just thinking ahead. that could be a advisory committee, figuring out what restitution looks like for our historic black watering holes, and that's something that you could potentially lead. Okay, well, thank you. Is there any other comments or questions? All right. Hearing no other comments or questions, the last item on our agenda before we recess until the next day, tomorrow, is Department of Justice updates.
Thank you, Chair Moore. My comments will be brief. I just wanted to acknowledge, before we left and adjourned in April, our legislature was preparing for the budget for the 2022-2023 fiscal year. As many of you know, when the Reparations Task Force was first assembled, there was no funding attached to it, and so it was, again, the Department of Justice and Attorney General Bonta who made sure that the task force had the resources that were needed in order to get us through this year. Thankfully, the legislature did fund the task force in the 2022-2023 budget, largely due to the efforts of Assemblymember Joan Sawyer, who was on that subcommittee, to make sure that not only did we get the funds to compensate DOJ for the contracts and all of the things that we'd entered into the previous year, but to make sure that the task force was fully funded for the 2022-2023 year. So we thank you for yours and for Senator Bradford's support in the legislature to make sure that we are resourced and able to keep up with all of the work that needs to be done. I also wanted to just briefly mention that Michael Newman and I had the honor and the privilege of being asked to be part of the delegation that appeared before the United Nations Committee on the Elimination of Race Discrimination. Attorney General Bonta was invited to attend, and he sent us in his stead. And so we traveled to Geneva, Switzerland with the United States delegation. It's a convention that is required of all member states to establish compliance with efforts that every nation is doing to eradicate race discrimination. And we had not attended this delegation, as many may know, with different changes in political administrations, but we were fortunate to return under the Biden administration, and California was specifically asked, along with the city of Atlanta, as the two local jurisdictions to be part of this delegation, to talk about the work that's being done in California to eradicate race discrimination. And needless to say, reparations was a hot topic amongst civil society and the members of the United Nations Committee. I will let the task force know that your work is certainly not going unnoticed. It was quite of a popular conversation, and although we certainly would like the federal government to take a lead in this area, it was noted that California is setting the pace for others to follow. And they were very commended the work that was being done by this task force, not only in civil society, but by members of the United Nations Committee from all over the world. The committee is currently chaired by Vereen Shepherd of Jamaica, who is the director of the Center for Reparation Research at the University of West Indies, and Dr. Faith Taluka of South Africa served as the lead country rapporteur. Both were very commendatory. I teased Dr. Brown earlier and said he's an international star because his name came up several times from members who had attended this convention. So again, Chair Moore and I had a conversation about this. I have reached out to U.S. Ambassador to the Human Rights Council, Michelle Taylor, and Desiree Cormier-Smith, who is the Special Representative for Racial Equity and Justice at the U.S. State Department, to see if they can attend a hearing in the future to talk about some of these issues and to, again, recognize and offer support for the work that's being done here. So thank you again for all of the work that you're doing, and it certainly was a pleasure and an honor to elevate this work internationally before the UN. And I'm sorry, Michael's reminding me, the entire report was submitted as part of the U.S. report to the UN, not only initially, but in the supplemental report that followed from the questions that were asked during the conference. So again, well done.
I think one last thing I'll add is that for the first time, the UN Committee on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination is calling on the United States government to begin the process of providing reparations to descendants of an enslaved people. And that would not have been the case if these two men did not go to Geneva, Switzerland to make that case. So thank you so much. Okay. So one last thing, if you all can announce where the room will be tomorrow before we go. Do we know?
In the Muses Room, which is the building just outside these doors, that way.
Okay. Thank you.
Hopefully everyone saw my
The Muses
direction.
Room right outside, across from the Rose Garden, the Muses Room.
Somebody will be here tomorrow. Somebody will direct traffic tomorrow.
Okay. Okay, but is the Muses Room different than the Wallace Annenberg Room? Because the Wallace Annenberg Room was it's the same. Okay. So the Muses / okay, great. And there'll be some people here to assist. Thank you all so much for your patience. Thank you all for the public comment. I'm happy to see you all here, and we'll see you all tomorrow. Thank you. It's recess.